Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Hi. Great. Well, Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome back to our seminar series. And what we have today is the first of 4 special seminar series for our plant ecology search. And we're very excited to have Elsa Ordway here from Harvard University. And Elsa is a interdisciplinary ecosystem scientist with a focus on plants and vegetation dynamics. Her undergraduate was at NYU. And she got her BA in environmental studies and African studies in 2009. And then she did a master's degree in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology at Columbia University, 2013. And then Elsa did her PhD in 2018. She received her PhD in Earth System Science at Stanford University with her advisor, Eric Lambert. And since then, Elsa has done a brief postdoc at Carnegie Institute, and then since then has been at Harvard University with Paul Moorcroft. So we're very excited to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to share some of my research with you today. I'm going to be talking about work that I do that leverages trait-based ecology and remote sensing to address questions in tropical forest ecosystems. A lot of my work is focused in the tropics, which are increasingly under pressure from land use and climate change. And you can see an example of that here. What you're looking at is LiDAR data, which is showing canopy cover. And what you're looking at is a forest in Malaysian Borneo that's actually been carved away by an oil palm plantation. And I'll come back to that later in my talk. But before I dive in, I want to go into some background and motivation for my research. So as I know many of you are aware, terrestrial ecosystems are increasingly under a huge amount of global environmental change pressures, and those come in the form of cropland and pasture land expansion, logging and urbanization, things like drought and fires, which are actually important aspects of a lot of ecosystems, are changing and increasing in severity and frequency with climate change. And in particular, the tropics have really been under a huge amount of pressure, largely in the form of deforestation currently. What you're seeing here is the tropical forest biome in green. And just in the last several decades, there's been increasing pressure from deforestation. So expanding agriculture in the tropics is the single greatest driver of deforestation globally, accounting for about 80% of forest conversion. And you can see that some of that just since the year 2000 shown in this data set from the Hansen Global Forest Change data set. And you're just seeing a few areas highlighted in each of the tropical forest regions across South America, Central Africa, and Southeast Asia. And just since 2000, gross tropical forest loss has amounted to more than the area equivalent to about the size of California, Nevada, Washington, and Oregon. So it's a huge amount. And the reason this matters is because these ecosystems are incredibly important. Despite covering less than 10% of the ice-free land surface, these systems maintain more than 2/3 of all biodiversity on the planet. They're home to more than 800 million people. And the energy, water, and carbon cycles in these systems are really important in terms of contributing to regional and global climate regulation. They account for more than 30% of terrestrial net primary productivity. And even with a huge amount of uncertainty in above ground biomass estimates, we know that they store about 20 to 40% of terrestrial carbon stocks, depending on what estimate you're using. And you can see that here, the y-axis here is latitude, and the x-axis is biomass stocks. And even with a huge amount of uncertainty, it's clear that a lot of the above ground biomass stocks are in the tropics. But both the drivers of deforestation and ecosystem responses to land use and climate change are complex, and they vary in space and time, and they can change really rapidly. This is a complex figure. What it's showing you is focused on fire and drought. I'm going to walk you through it. So the colors across each of the tropical forest regions are showing fire radiative power, which is a metric associated with fire emissions and the CO2 emission, fire radiative power and heat transfer, and the CO2 emissions associated with the fires. The triangles are linked to mortality. The open triangles are showing tree mortality associated with fire. And the filled-in triangles are identifying tree mortality associated with drought. And this is based on a lit review. So these are kind of known cases of mortality and fire radiative power across the tropics. And a couple things I want to highlight are that there's a huge amount of variation in the fire that these systems are exposed to, and disturbances they're exposed to, and also how they respond to something like fire or drought. Also, you'll notice in Central Africa there aren't quite that many triangles, and that's not because these systems aren't responding to change, but more that there's a lack of information and a lack of research, published research on the topic. And even in addition to the huge amount of uncertainty in how these systems are currently responding to change, there's a huge amount of uncertainty in how plants and vegetation dynamics across tropical forests will respond to change in the future. What I'm showing you here are 11 different Earth system models projected towards the end of the century. And these models vary in some ways, including whether or not, for example, they incorporate the nitrogen cycle in green, or the purple models incorporate prescribed land use change emissions. But the point of this is that they're not even getting the sign in agreement in terms of their predictions. So by the end of the century, some of these models suggest that terrestrial vegetation could store as much as 750 petagrams of carbon, and other models suggest that these same systems could actually be emitting carbon to the atmosphere. So this is pretty problematic. A more recent paper that came out a few years ago really highlighted that a huge amount of this uncertainty is linked to our uncertainty of tropical forest systems and our inability to constrain what's happening in those systems. So this brings me to my research goals, which are broadly focused on trying to understand impacts and consequences of both land use and climate change on terrestrial ecosystems and vegetation dynamics. And to address my research, I take a social ecological systems approach. So I focus a lot on the ecological systems in terms of their structure, their function, particularly thinking about the plants in these systems. I also focus on the social systems, so with the cultural, economical, political context within those systems, and importantly, the interactions and the feedbacks. So as an example, my research is focused on tropical forest regions in a changing world. And if we're thinking about land use change, as these forests get carved away, I'm thinking about what are the market systems, who are the stakeholders engaged in that change, as well as what are the ecological dynamics in these systems, and what are the impacts, both currently and in the future. So if we break it down, my research is really focused on thinking about the causes, the consequences, and the future change. And I really rely on trait-based ecology methods and approaches and theory, as well as remote sensing as a tool for addressing these research areas. And I draw on methods that include, on the socioeconomic analysis side, farmer surveys and supply chain analysis. On the thinking about large-scale patterns of vegetation dynamics, machine learning, and empirical analysis. And I also do work that incorporates model data fusion, so linking field data and remote sensing data to dynamic global vegetation models, really to try to leverage mechanistic modeling to understand how these systems will change in the future. So today I'm going to talk about 3 different themes in my research. First, I'll talk about the causes of change and thinking about pathways of deforestation. I'll also talk about consequences, and in this case, thinking about how does this large-scale, really rapid deforestation influence the forests that are still there. And in the third part, I'll talk about ecosystem heterogeneity and the work I'm doing to try to incorporate community-level variation into these terrestrial biosphere models. Before I dive in, I just want to acknowledge some of the many collaborators I've worked with. This work is really not something I could do on my own, and it's definitely made possible through a lot of collaboration with some really incredible folks. And importantly, I also want to thank a lot of people who have helped out in the field. So I'm going to talk about work today that was conducted in Cameroon as well as in Malaysia. And a lot of students and folks who are really engaged in these efforts locally helped out enormously in making this possible. Okay, so in terms of part 1, I'll talk about pathways of deforestation, and specifically deforestation associated with oil palm expansion. For those of you who don't know, vegetable oil production has increased rapidly over the last several decades. You're seeing production here on the y-axis for the top 4 oil crops since the 1970s. And demand for vegetable oils generally has increased, but palm oil in particular has really surged in terms of production at a much more rapid rate, to the point where it's now in about 50% of any product you would buy in a grocery store, including here in LA. And it's contributed to a huge amount of deforestation. And this is in part because of the high profitability and productivity. It's the highest yielding oil crop. And importantly, palm oil can only be produced in the tropics. So soy can actually be produced in Brazil, but it's also produced here in the US. The croppable area for oil palm is really constricted to tropical latitudes. So a lot of people are focused on how can we come up with solutions to prevent this deforestation, and that's involving a lot of scientists as well as private agencies, NGOs, local governments, and they're really focusing on this supply chain approach. So I'm going to walk you through what that actually means. After palm oil is produced and harvested, it's got to be brought to a mill within about 24 to 48 hours, after which point it really quickly starts to decay. So there's this milling processing point that really creates this bottleneck. After that point, a lot of these companies, particularly in Southeast Asia where most of this expansion is happening, these large company mills will then ship off the product for further refining, after which point it becomes a biofuel, vegetable oil, or some cosmetic product. But zero deforestation strategies based on Southeast Asian pathways of expansion have really highlighted these mills as a point of potential for conservation solutions. But increasingly, as land becomes more limited in Southeast Asia, and there's a lot of oversight from governments and NGOs on the regulation side, a lot of companies are looking to move elsewhere. And the crop actually is native to Central and West Africa. And so a lot of companies are actually looking to move there. And you can see some companies see this really as an opportunity, whereas others really are focusing on the potential harmful ecological consequences of that. So in this section, I'm going to be really asking what oil palm expansion pathways contribute to deforestation. And by that I mean, where and why is oil palm expansion happening and who's engaged in the production? So if we look across the key countries in the tropical forest region in Africa, what I found in terms of expansion was that Cameroon really saw most of the area expansion since the year 2000. So this is the rate of area expansion for oil palm production since the year 2000. And what's interesting about this is that 80% of local edible demand for vegetable oil in Cameroon is linked to palm oil. And it's actually one of the top producing countries in Africa. And if you look at this more closely, it looks like most of this production is really, area harvested, here now shown in green, is really linked to, area harvested shown in brown, is really linked to the increases that we're seeing in production shown in green. And that's been at the same time that yields have really remained stagnant, if not declining. So what this suggests is that increases in production are happening from expansion as opposed to an increase in yield. But these country level statistics don't really tell us anything about where this is happening or whether it's contributing to deforestation. So I conducted a remote sensing analysis in southwest Cameroon, which is the top oil palm producing region in the country. And it actually remains about 86% forested. And I used a random forest classifier, which is a machine learning approach that to classify Landsat satellite imagery for the year 2000 to 2015, so the period that we saw that really big boom in expansion. And I did this to identify where oil palm was on the landscape and what land cover it was expanding, what it was replacing. So what I found was that over 2/3 of oil palm expansion since 2000 resulted in forest conversion, shown here in red. So this is the southwest region. The red areas are showing areas of forest converted to oil palm, whereas less than 1/3 was actually some other crop type or some other land cover type being converted to palm oil. And the white areas are these plantation boundaries, these company boundaries. And what was really interesting about this was that most of this, so about 2/3 of the expansion into forest areas, was actually outside of company boundaries, suggesting that a lot of small-scale farmers are engaged in this expansion. And I was really interested in what factors are contributing to this expansion outside company plantations. And I talked to you earlier about this milling constraint. So we mapped all the mills across southwest Cameroon and found that of about 500 mills that we geo-referenced, only 5 of them were company mills, and the rest were really small-scale, poorly mechanized mills, typically informal, so not really regulated. And so you're seeing an example of the kind of 2 ends of the spectrum. This is a company mill. The company mills are the 5 orange points here on this figure that's showing the year of the mill establishment for all of the 500 mills we mapped. And that's in comparison with, in this case, a completely manual hand press mill, and then there was a huge amount of variation in between. But a lot of these mills, which were established pretty recently, are very poorly mechanized or only semi-mechanized mills. And I was interested in looking at the relationship between where these mills are located across the landscape and the expansion that we're seeing to see if there's any relationship. So now you're seeing those mills dotted across the landscape with the 5 company mills shown as the largest dots. And I looked at this compared to other things that we know to influence deforestation. I'm just going to focus on the milling variables today to highlight a couple points. What we found was that there were greater odds of oil palm expansion near these informal mills. So you're seeing here the log odds ratios. And what this suggests is that oil palm expansion was about 10% more likely with every kilometer increase in proximity to a mill. And in addition to that, deforestation was actually almost 50% more likely with every 10% decrease in the mill extraction rate. And what that means is just kind of the mill yield. So you've got this crop yield on the farm, and then in the case of oil palm, you also have this milling yield. So not only was expansion likely near these mills, but it was near the lowest yielding mills. And I don't have time to go into this paper today, but I want to highlight a couple points that we learned from talking to a lot of these farmers across the region. We found that there was a huge preference for informal mills. So about 73% of producers actually preferred to mill at these informal mills. I can go into that with anyone who's interested later. There's a lot of interesting things there. And then also, not only did these farms have really, really low crop yields, they also had really low milling yields since they were processing at these informal mills. What also was kind of surprising to me was that 75% of farmers surveyed reported clearing forests. And this is surprising because I wouldn't expect somebody to tell me that they're clearing forests to expand their farm. But what we found out was that it's actually very linked to a lot of the land tenure laws. And there's a lot more to go into there as well. But to wrap this section up, one of the things we found was that, in fact, it's small-scale farmers that are expanding into forest areas, not large companies. And it's really linked to informal markets, closely tied to very local consumer demand. So vegetable oil production is actually expected to triple across sub-Saharan Africa by 2050, which could place a huge threat to these ecosystems, these really important forest ecosystems. And that it's really linked to these local demands and low yields, but that there's potentially really different sustainability solutions in this scenario. So it's not as if we can just take this supply chain strategy that's been developed in Southeast Asia and translate it to another region. There's a lot of really locally important dynamics that are unique to this system that need to be considered. So working with collaborators at the Center for International Forestry Research and WWF, we put together a policy brief that really highlighted some of these recommendations and held a workshop with a lot of folks who work in the government ministries to actually talk through how some of these could be implemented. And that's really in line with this broader initiative, the Africa Palm Oil Initiative. 10 different countries across Central and West Africa are trying to think proactively about how to engage in sustainability solutions in a way that's proactive to prevent the type of really large-scale deforestation that we've seen in places like Indonesia and Malaysia. Okay. So I'm going to switch gears to the ecological side of things now, after talking about the social component and the sustainability solutions drawn from that. So in part 2, I want to focus on the consequences of deforestation for the forests that are still left standing. And the questions I'm really interested in here is, how does deforestation affect ecosystem structure and function in these remaining forests, and does that vary across communities in space as well as in time? So I just told you a lot about oil palm expansion in Africa, but again, most of what has occurred has really been concentrated in 2 countries, Indonesia and Malaysia, in Southeast Asia. And since 2000, along with a lot of oil palm expansion and lots of other drivers of deforestation, 20% of tropical forests are now within about 100 meters of a forest edge, which is a pretty alarming number. And so this really becomes an edge effects question. And there's a huge body of literature that has documented the ways that edges can affect ecosystems. And I'm going to walk through some of that here. So through changes in micrometeorological conditions like changes in light and wind and vapor pressure deficit, air and soil temperatures and soil moisture create conditions along the edge that are very distinct from the forest interior, which can considerably affect the forest ecosystem's integrity. So in the tropics, trees can grow really, really tall and tend to, at times, have shallow root systems. And the elevated wind speeds and temperature along these edges can make trees more susceptible to things like wind throw, heat stress, drought conditions, leading to the potential blowdown of large trees, which creates these canopy gaps in a system that is an otherwise light-limited system, allowing light to penetrate through to the understory. And ultimately, these changes can impact plant growth and mortality, and as well as primary productivity. And given enough time, if pioneer species move in and are able to dominate, it can lead to species composition shifts as well. So I looked at edge effects in terms of thinking about how do these systems, well, one of the things I should say is that a lot of this comes from a lot of understanding of what's going on at a handful of sites, field-based sites. But despite that, we know that the tropics are incredibly heterogeneous in terms of structure, biodiversity, how they function. And there's really, as a lot of the tropics get carved up, a need to understand how these dynamics affect potentially different tropical forest ecosystems differently. So to do this, I used remote sensing data. I used LiDAR and hyperspectral data to look at how edges affected both forest structure and a few key leaf traits. So in terms of the LiDAR data, I was looking at how, well, let me step back for a second. This data was collected by the Global Airborne Observatory during a flight campaign in 2016 across Malaysia and Borneo. And this was an effort led by Greg Asner and the entire team that helps to run the Global Airborne Observatory. So the forest structure data that we were able to use comes from the LiDAR information. And specifically, I'm looking at canopy height, canopy gaps, both in terms of the size and frequency of those gaps, and estimated above ground biomass, which we're able to estimate using allometric relationships from the LiDAR data. I also looked at 3 leaf traits, which I hypothesized would be impacted by these edge effects. And these were derived from the high fidelity imaging spectroscopy data. I don't have a whole bunch of time to go into the methods, but I would be happy to talk to anybody afterwards about how that's estimated. But I focused on 3 key leaf traits that are important in terms of photosynthetic capacity and plant growth strategies. Again, I'm not going to go into detail here, but I do want to highlight that there was a huge amount of work that went into actually estimating these trait data from the remote sensing data that involves going out and collecting leaf samples from the fully sunlit portion of the tops of these tree crowns, and then linking that to the spectra from the imaging spectroscopy data. Somebody who is really involved with this is Dana Chadwick, who's a postdoc at Stanford, and she's actually leading a lot of this work for NEON now across a lot of their sites. Okay, so this edge effects work was conducted again in Sabah, Malaysia, Southeast Asia. And we looked at 27 different edge sites across the state of Sabah, which you see here indicated by the white dots. So the remaining forest cover here is highlighted in green, and the oil palm areas are shown in brown. And these 27 edge sites varied in terms of the forest type, the forest community, as well as the edge age, the soil type, the topography, and the level of degradation, which in this part of Malaysia really means how many times has that forest been logged. There were only a few sites that were completely intact. So this is, again, that LiDAR data now looking from a bird's eye view, just to highlight the stark contrast along these edges. So on the left, you're seeing the oil palm plantations, which come in at about 11 meters tall at full maturity. And that's really in contrast with this incredibly heterogeneous, but much, much taller forest canopy that easily reaches about 65 meters. So to identify whether edges did significantly affect these different key variables, I used a change point analysis, which is a pretty widely used method in other disciplines. And the null hypothesis here is that if we don't see any sort of edge effect, we would be looking at our variable of interest as a function of distance to edge, and there would be no significant change detected. Whereas if we do see a significant edge effect, we would expect that variable to either decline or potentially increase as a function of distance to edge. And you're seeing that here, looking at above ground carbon, the mean change in carbon as a function of distance to edge. So 0 is that forest oil palm boundary, and as you move along the x-axis, you're moving into the forest. And using a couple different fits, nonlinear and linear fits, we identified whether or not there was a significant point where that variable changed. And if there was a significant effect, then that change point identifies the scale at which that edge effect persists. So that tells us how far into the forest does that edge effect penetrate. And we looked at that independently for each variable. And from that, we can also identify what's the magnitude of change, in this case, in above ground carbon, looking at the mean values of carbon in this forest interior and the mean values at the edge to get the percent difference. So you've seen the results here for above ground carbon, and this, what I'm showing you here is above ground carbon, again, plotted as a function of distance to edge for each of the 27 forest sites. So the dotted lines are each of those sites, and then this large solid, or the thicker solid white line, is the average effect. And what we found was that at all of these sites, despite differences in edge age, forest community, we saw significant declines in above ground carbon, which was surprising to me. I thought we would see it in some locations, but not all. But you'll notice there's a huge amount of variability. So on average, we saw that this decline in above ground carbon persisted for about 100 meters into the forest, but that ranged from anywhere from 35 to 300 meters. We also found that on average, above ground carbon was about 22% lower at the forest edge, but that ranged from about 16 to 30%. So I was really interested in how does this correspond to other changes in thinking about structure and these different leaf traits. So you're seeing here that above ground carbon in terms of the magnitude, so that 22% on average decline, now plotted as a box plot. And again, we also looked at 3 leaf traits: leaf mass per area, leaf nitrogen, and leaf phosphorus, as well as canopy structure characteristics, so canopy height, and then these 2 canopy gap dynamics, frequency and size, which are plotted on a different scale. And a couple of things that really were interesting and surprising to me. One, we found that canopy gaps increased in size and frequency at less than half of the site. So I really expected this canopy gap or gap phase dynamics to be a key component of the changes that are happening along these edges. But that was only the case at about 40% of the sites. Despite that absence of canopy gaps, at almost all the sites, we saw significant declines in canopy height and leaf mass per area, and we saw significant increases in leaf phosphorus, suggesting that carbon declines are not just due to structural changes in the canopy gaps, and even without this major tree crown damage or blowdowns, the change in the micrometeorological conditions and the lateral penetration of that is enough to have a pretty important effect on these other key aspects of ecosystem function that ultimately underpin these declines in carbon. One of the other questions, I'm not going to dive too much into this, but I want to highlight a couple other things we looked at, was why was there so much variation in these effects? And what we found was that in general, edge age was really linked to the magnitude of carbon decline. So carbon decline amplified over time in terms of magnitude. And an interesting thing to point out about this was that the edges we looked at varied from about 2 years of that edge being present to a little over 40 years. And so even at the edges that were only 2 years old, there was already some significant effect, but again, that amplified over time. In terms of the spatial scale of carbon loss, so the persistence over which that carbon decline occurred into the forest, that was more linked to these impacts on structure and function. So that was really, the scale of carbon decline was really correlated to the scale of things like impacts on leaf mass per area, leaf phosphorus concentrations, and canopy height. And that in turn varied with things like topography and soil type, to the point where we were able to identify a few well-studied forest communities that had pretty distinct edge effects. So just to sum up, we did find significant carbon stock declines along all of these edges, but that was very much underpinned by pretty distinct effects on structure and function that varied or co-varied across these different sites. And that yes, these effects do vary in terms of space and time, and it was really heterogeneity in structure and function across these different forest communities, which I didn't have a whole lot of time to go into today, that influence the ecosystem responses to change. In the next section, I'm going to talk about one of those communities that we know pretty well, or sites with 3 different communities that we know pretty well. And so that brings me to this third part, where I'm going to talk about ecosystem heterogeneity and how I'm working to incorporate that in a dynamic global vegetation model. And this is really motivated by the fact that these models are the tools that we use to understand how these systems are going to change in the future. And currently, there's a real lack of heterogeneity that we know to be present across the tropics incorporated into these models. So just to kind of bring that point home, these are a couple of figures showing just how much structure, function, and biodiversity can vary across the tropics. On the left, you're seeing above ground biomass estimates that were published in 2011, showing a huge amount of variation across the tropics. A paper that came out a couple years ago showed that variation in above ground carbon is not correlated with variation in biodiversity. So you're seeing the 3 major tropical forest regions in this plot shown by the 3 different colors. And if you look at the x-axis, on the top you're seeing the distributions. And we know that South America and Southeast Asia tend to have much higher species diversity than Central Africa, and we see that here. What's interesting is that it's Central Africa and Southeast Asia that have much higher biomass than South America. So there's interesting dynamics and not a direct correlation. And a lot of this comes from very unique heterogeneity that's still being explored in terms of the environmental edaphic climate underpinnings to this variation. Just an interesting example of some of the structural differences. This is from our LiDAR data showing you a site called El Pahuayo in the western Amazon in Peru relative to a site in Danam Valley in Malaysia. And these are plotted on the same height scale. So you can see that the forest in Peru in the western Amazon tops out at about 40 meters. And the forest in Danam Valley the trees easily get up to about 90 meters tall. And actually from this large landscape scale mapping, it was revealed just this year that currently the tallest known tropical tree in the tropics is actually located at this site in Danam Valley. And it tops out at about 100 meters. And for anyone who's interested, it's a Shorea species, which was really well documented in this nice paper that came out last year. So a Shorea species is in the Dipterocarp family, which is a family that dominates a lot of these forests in Southeast Asia. There's also a huge amount of sub-regional variation across these communities that is incredibly important and not well represented in these models. This is just an example from a couple papers looking at the Amazon basin that point out huge variation in important traits, plant traits like wood density, the proportion of nodulating genera, and end-fixing fabaceae trees, variation across the Amazon in terms of species diversity here in Fisher's Alpha. So there's, again, just a huge amount of both regional as well as sub-regional variation that's very, very underrepresented in these models. So I'm interested in using remote sensing data to understand whether or not we can inform ecosystem heterogeneity in these models, and in doing so, improve our ability to model tropical vegetation dynamics. So these models that I'm using in this terrestrial biosphere model, I'll talk about the specific model in just a minute, but ultimately what we're doing, it's a mechanistic model, and we force it with meteorological information and soil characteristics, in this case soil depth and texture, as well as initial vegetation conditions. And we're able to model carbon and energy and water fluxes for a system. So there are a number of different types of terrestrial biosphere models. The one I use is actually a demography model called the ecosystem demography model. And it sits in this sweet spot between these 2 other kind of categories of TBMs. On the left hand, you've got big leaf models, which are incredibly homogeneous in terms of how they represent vegetation dynamics. And that is, sitting in a room of ecologists, it feels very limiting, but the power of these models is their ability to actually scale up dynamics and operate at large and global spatial scales in a way that makes them very able to communicate and be run with climate models. But obviously there's limitations with this. On the other side are these gap dynamics models, which are incredibly heterogeneous in terms of how they characterize both the vertical and the horizontal heterogeneity of these ecosystems. For that reason, they're computationally incredibly expensive, and so they're often run at these very local scales. These demography models sit in the middle in their ability to capture that horizontal and vertical heterogeneity, and then aggregate that information up through some pretty clever calculations in a way that allows them to be run at regional and potentially global spatial scales to ask questions about these ecosystems at large scales. So traditionally, these models are informed and parameterized with field data that's collected across plots. And in the tropics, there's a growing network of plots that are now really being synthesized through plot networks that have been hugely informative, including in our ability to actually inform these models. These data are also used to actually benchmark how well are these models doing. Are they getting these systems, representing these systems accurately? But given the huge amount of cost and often difficulty in accessing a lot of these systems, these plots only cover a very small fraction of these enormous tropical forest ecosystems. And again, we know that these systems are incredibly heterogeneous. And so I think there's a huge amount of potential to use remote sensing data to actually capture some of these dynamics at these larger spatial scales in a way that's slightly more compatible with what we're trying to accomplish with these models. So today I'm going to talk about how I'm doing that in Malaysian Borneo, again, focusing on this one site called Sepalak Forest Reserve, which is a really interesting site because it spans this edaphic gradient. So in Sepalak, which has been well characterized by quite a few different research groups, there's this topoedaphic gradient from kind of higher fertility. So I should say across the tropics, soils are incredibly nutrient poor, but this is really a relative scale here. So alluvial forests in Sepalak have relatively more fertile soils compared to heath forests on the other end of the spectrum that have much more nutrient poor and actually very acidic podzolic soils. And then in the middle you have these sandstone forests. And you're seeing here again the LiDAR data representing the vegetation structure in these systems. And we know that there are differences in the soil conditions, there's differences in topography, but what's interesting is that we see that reflected in the differences in canopy height heterogeneity, gap dynamics. So for example, in the heath forests, these are really stemmy forests with trees that only get to be about 35 meters tall. In sandstone forests, or rather in alluvial forests where there's relatively more nutrient availability, higher turnover rates, trees get much taller, but there's more, the turnover rates seem to be influencing more canopy height heterogeneity. You can see that here. This is canopy height for each of those three forests, with heath forest being much lower in canopy height. These differences are also reflected in above ground carbon differences. And actually sandstone forests, which sit in the middle, tend to have much slower growing, longer lived, really large trees that end up storing a lot more biomass. So one of the things I want to talk about before diving in is how we think about diversity in these models. So we think about species diversity in the model world in terms of plant functional diversity. And the way we actually implement that in the models is through these discrete plant functional types. So you can think of a plant functional type as being an evergreen tree or a deciduous tree. So all species that are evergreen get lumped into that category. All species that are deciduous get lumped into that category. In the tropics, we think about plant functional types along this successional gradient from early, mid, and late successional species, which is a bit of a difficult thing to actually define. It's easier for earlier successional species, but in a lot of these systems, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of species, and actually categorizing that information can prove to be very challenging and somewhat subjective. So I'm going to talk today about how we're actually parameterizing these plant functional types using data, using observations from the remote sensing data on traits. And the two traits in particular that we're using to inform the PFTs that are parameterized in the model are specific leaf area, which we calculate from leaf mass per area, which you saw earlier, as well as photosynthetic capacity, which we estimate from leaf nitrogen and leaf phosphorus. So one of the things that we found prior to looking at the model output was that just looking at these traits across these 3 forest sites, we saw pretty interesting differences. So in the alluvial forest, we found lower leaf mass per area, which suggests shorter leaf lifespan and higher leaf turnover, which is consistent with our knowledge of higher turnover rates in these systems. In the heath forest, we found higher leaf mass per area and leaf nitrogen and leaf phosphorus, or lower leaf nitrogen and phosphorus and higher leaf mass per area, suggesting potentially higher nutrient use efficiency and greater investment and structure and defense, which again is consistent with what we would expect on these really nutrient poor soils. What's interesting is that if you look at the 2 traits that we actually use to parameterize the model, so now estimated VC max, or that photosynthetic capacity plotted against specific leaf area, we see across this edaphic gradient this kind of decoupling of trait relationships. So if you look at the alluvial forest, each of the 3 colors indicate these 3 different forest types. The alluvial forest has a stronger relationship between photosynthetic capacity and SLA. But as you move to the heath forest on the other end of the spectrum, that relationship becomes completely just insignificant. And so we use this information in the model to hopefully incorporate these differences in potential differences in carbon allocation strategies to represent vegetation dynamics in the model. So again, it's these 2 traits here that we're using, VC max and SLA. And I'm going to show you some results where we first do not use the remote sensing data and then use the remote sensing data to parameterize plant functional types. So these are results from not using the remote sensing data. I'm going to walk you through this. You're seeing above ground biomass on the top and gross primary productivity on the bottom. These are for long-term simulations, so we're running the model for about 300 years. And again, the key is to try to use this model to ask questions about how these systems will change over the long term. And each of the 3 different forest types are shown by the different colors here. And there's 2 different ways we initialize these models. So the dotted line is showing near bare ground runs, where we essentially grow up a forest from nothing. And the top runs are initialized, shown in the solid lines, are initialized with inventory plot data. So plot data from actually going out and measuring these trees. And what you can see is that over this 300-year run, all of these simulations converge to a single equilibrium. Despite capturing these differences in the beginning from the initialized plot data, they all essentially, the model thinks there's one type of tropical forest. And so it's not doing what we want it to do. And we see the same thing in terms of GPP. If we do use the remote sensing data, so again, all we're doing here now is parameterizing plant functional types with the information from the remotely sensed data, we see that we're able to preserve differences in above ground biomass and GPP over these long-term simulations. There's a couple things I want to point out here. So in terms of GPP, we would expect that to be highest in this alluvial forest. But we're clearly not getting something right in the model. So you'll notice that these switch at some point in the simulation. And what that suggests is some of the processes in the model need further development. And specifically, one of the things we're looking at right now is whether it's related to nutrient cycling and how that's actually incorporated in the model, as well as background mortality rates linked to some of the differences between the alluvial and sandstone system. So on the one hand, this is incredibly promising because it offers a way to incorporate remotely sensed data and capture these community level differences in function and preserve that over these long-term simulations, allowing to ask questions like, how do different communities respond differently to change? But clearly there's more model development work in moving towards this model data fusion to get these dynamics right. So in short, yes, we can use remote sensing data to inform ecosystem heterogeneity. And I think this is a really exciting area for future research. But clearly there's a lot more work to be done to get it right. And I think there's a lot of different opportunities to also further explore what are the important traits that we're measuring from remotely sensed data that are worth incorporating in these models to get these dynamics right. And I just want to point out really quickly that capturing this heterogeneity is really important. There was a paper that came out last year that showed that a lot of models are not accounting for things like phosphorus limitation. And if we don't do that compared to models that do, we could be overestimating how much these systems are ability to store in terms of above ground biomass by as much as 50%. That was just one study looking at the central Amazon, but there's a huge amount of potential components to how these vegetation dynamics could change in the future that we might be over or underestimating or completely missing the mark on if we're not accounting for a lot of these differences. So in wrapping up, I want to talk about a couple of future research directions and then one little point about teaching. One of the two areas that I really am excited to continue moving forward in is related to these questions about regional and sub-regional heterogeneity in terrestrial ecosystem function. So I'm actually submitting a grant right now with Paul Moorcroft, Sabrina Russo, and Stuart Davies. It's part of the DOE terrestrial ecosystem science proposal, or call for funding. And it's very much linked to the phase 2 of the NG Tropics program that's working largely in the neotropics, but is expanding out to a site in Southeast Asia. And this work would really complement that in thinking about how do these traits vary across these different communities, and also what are we actually capturing when we're looking at traits that are measured at the very top of the canopy compared to what's actually represented sub-canopy and potentially in terms of below ground processes as well. Another big component of my research and moving forward is, again, still thinking about these social ecological systems and specifically asking questions about how sensitivity or resilience to disturbance can vary across these systems. So again, thinking about what are the ecological responses, but also what are the human components to that, and how do those interactions influence a system's sensitivity. And this work is really conducive to funding from NSF's dynamics of coupled natural and human systems. So one other thing I want to talk about, I was able to teach a course a couple times at Stanford, and it's a field-based course in social ecological systems, and this is something I'd be really excited to develop here, potentially building on the work I've done in the tropics or in California's ecosystems. I think there's a lot of really parallel questions. So this course was based in Southeast Alaska, and we focused on forestry, fisheries, energy, and tourism. And again, it was a field course, so students had the opportunity to learn about these ecosystems, as well as talk to a lot of community members and try to understand what are the differences in opinions about conservation, sustainability, resource use, what are the different approaches to conservation. They actually, what you just saw a minute ago, they got to go out and measure old growth and logged forests and use their own data and data from past courses to actually ask questions about what are differences in structure and diversity across those two types of systems. And so this is a really, I think, fun way to engage students in really place-based learning and actually talk to a lot of community members who know those ecosystems really well. In the case of Southeast Alaska, people are incredibly connected to those ecosystems, but also have very different opinions about sustainability solutions and conservation. So with that, I would like to just acknowledge a lot of folks who have contributed to this work in the Moorcroft Lab, the Lambin Lab, and the Asner Lab, as well as a lot of other field and research collaborators. I'd also like to thank my funding sources and the huge amount of field support and plot network partners who have been very, very generous in contributing data. And with that, I'm happy to take questions if there's time, and thank you for your attention.
We do have plenty of time.
Okay.
When you talked about the edge effects,
Yep.
it seems like some of it was changes in size structure and some of it was changes in the environment going in from the edge, like the meteorology, the use of dry system. But do you have, are there good measures of how the environment changes along those edges, like locally? Do you have good data like from the edge and like how you walk in, how the environment can you use that to see if the changes correspond to how much you expect from that environmental shift?
Yeah, it's a great question. A couple things there. So we did see changes in structure at all the sites. It just wasn't necessarily canopy gap dynamics, because we did see canopy height reduced, which could be indicative of a number of different things. I went out and actually attempted to measure some of those micrometeorological variables, but in such a short field time period, it's difficult to actually capture that adequately. But there is some published work that's looked specifically at soil moisture, air temperature differences. Air temperature, for example, has, I think it's a 6 degrees Celsius difference between oil palm plantations and logged forests, and even more with closed canopy forests, specifically in that same state in Malaysian Borneo. So there's a lot of work trying to understand just how stark those differences are in terms of the micrometeorological conditions, but we had to rely on other people's data in that case to kind of build that out. Yeah.
I was just curious if you have any thought with the heterogeneity in gap dynamic or in edge effects. How much of that is compositional changes? Because you can imagine a primary forest that's been thinned out and dragged versus succession happening at a forest edge, and those might be different endpoints in a spectrum of edge responses. Do you have any way from the data, or have you and your colleagues thought about trying to use composition to try to make sense of some of that resolution?
So there are ways to, that Sepalak site was one area where I focused heavily when I was trying to interpret a lot of those edge effects results, because it has been so well characterized. There are field plots there, and I've looked at the field data from those 3 sites, and I know that in terms of species composition, they are different. And so in that case, it's really interesting because we did see distinct edge effects at each of those 3 sites that seemed to correspond potentially with different demography and succession in those different dynamics. But I also think that a lot of it was corresponding to some of the abiotic conditions, so the actual differences in nutrient limitations and differences in topography. So the alluvial forest compared to the sandstone forest, for example, the alluvial is in these low-lying areas, and I saw there were significant gap dynamics, edge effects on gap dynamics in that alluvial forest and not in the sandstone forest, which I think is more linked to shallower root systems, potentially greater wind penetration, and species that are prone to kind of a lower background rate of mortality and turnover already. So it was hard to do across all of the 27 sites, and I think there's a lot more on-the-ground investigation that needs to happen to understand those communities to answer that question. But in the case where we have pretty good data, we attempted to look at that in the case of Sepalak. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any, in these recent deforestation areas, do you have any idea of if there is an effect, or if you have data on how it was deforested, if it was fire, or it was something like that?
So that's a really important question. Are you asking about the Southeast Asia deforestation in particular, or Cameroon? Both. Okay. I don't have a whole lot of data on that, but it is a really important part of it. So we tried to get data for the edge effects work. I was trying to get as much information about that as I could in terms of whether or not the forest was cleared through methods linked to burning versus mechanical removal. Or in a lot of cases, these areas will be heavily logged and then converted to an oil palm plantation, so it could already be responding to some level of disturbance before an edge is even created. But it was really difficult to get that information. I looked at some of the burn data products, and it's just too coarse a scale and wasn't really that valuable in terms of getting variation across the specific 27 sites. And I talked to a lot of folks in the field, and it was the people who really had that information weren't willing to share it. But I think it's a really important question that requires thinking about, because I do think that there are, Doug Morton at NASA Goddard is actually asking similar questions about how do things like fire as a method of clearing impact different forest responses in ways that are potentially different to somebody mechanically clearing. So I think I don't have a great answer to it, but I think it's an important part of the question.
Okay, well, thank you all, and thanks very much.
I think we might have one more.
Oh, wait.
If there's time.
I was just curious about the first part, about the palm oil expansion into Central Africa. I think it's really interesting that you actually found that it was this sort of more informal market and local demand that was driving a lot of deforestation. That's sort of counter to, I guess, my expectations about the cause of deforestation. So I was just curious, is there an increase in the local demand that's been happening in recent time, or is this something that's just simply the demand's been there and then they realized that they can meet it with palm oil? And I'm just curious, like, what are the economic drivers of local demand?
Yeah, there's a couple of components to that. It's so palm oil has been consumed there for a long time. People have gone out into the forest, and I mean, it's a native species to those forest ecosystems. So people have gone out and harvested the palm nuts and turned that into oil for a very long time. And plantations have actually been there since the early 1900s, large plantations, only a couple. But there's dynamics that have been changing in the last several decades that are contributing to an increase in demand. And part of that is population growth. Part of it is a lot of people moving to cities and shifting diets. And part of it is the government anticipating that there's going to be a huge amount of demand either in the country of Cameroon or in neighboring countries. So actually Cameroon, Gabon, a couple other countries have set these targets for what they want to get their palm oil production to. And it's in part to meet their local demands because they're actually importing a lot of it from Southeast Asia because they can't produce enough of it yet, partly because yields are so incredibly low. And so there's this desire to meet existing local demand that they can't saturate, anticipate how that's going to increase. Again, I said earlier that vegetable oil production is expected to triple by 2050 across sub-Saharan Africa. So even if they're not going to, even if they can meet Cameroon's demands, they're anticipating potentially trading with other countries in Central and West Africa. So there's a lot of factors at play. But it is a very different dynamic. I mean, it's considered kind of a staple crop there in a way that it's not elsewhere, which I think also feeds into how we think about conservation solutions. There's kind of a food security component in sub-Saharan Africa that isn't really a part of the conversation in Southeast Asia. Yeah. Okay.
So can I ask you kind of a big picture question about your research program? What you described is sort of this wonderfully broad array from intensive field work to big data to what I presume was pretty heavy computation, and from ecological to sociological dynamics. Do you envision rolling out that entire program under your umbrella here, or is this really something which you conducted embedded in a network of collaborators, and you'll specialize in your lab in a particular facet of it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. More the latter, and I think my work will continue to focus really on this connection between the field observations and remote sensing observations. What are we actually getting with remote sensing observations? How can we address key ecological questions that we haven't been able to from field data? I see myself as now having a really great network of folks who do a lot of the modeling. There's a lot of folks at DOE I work with back at Harvard who I think will continue to be the modeler developers on that side of things, who I would engage with, but I don't see myself as being a terrestrial biosphere model developer. On the social side, I think there's a lot of complementary questions that arise from working in these very local scale systems that I would see as kind of building off of the work that I'm doing in a place-based way that are relevant to the people I'm working with, the communities I work within. So really focusing on the remote sensing and field component and other things building out from the places I work and the collaborators I have.
All right, well, thank you all.